Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to look at one of the specific areas of interviewing that I don't think is discussed quite often enough, and that is the difference between interviewing men and women. And helping us to do so is expert and psychologist Paul Clifford from Paul Clifford Psychology. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, James. Thanks. Great to be here.
Tell me a bit about your background, Paul, and the type of work you do.
Yeah, well, I did a psychology degree and started in recruitment. I had sort of mapped out a bit of a plan for where I would go, and it started with recruitment and did about 10 years in that, both in-house and then agencies as well. And I could have continued with recruitment. I was really enjoying it, but I thought I wanted to progress to the next stage, and that was to be a human resources consultant. So got a job with that. And then after 3 years, I then moved into organisational psychology.
So are there differences between men and women in the workplace, or is it a bit of a myth?
Well, I don't think it's in particular situations, I think. I mean, if you go into any workplace, you wouldn't necessarily look and go, oh, hang on a minute, women are doing this and men are doing that. But I think it's more in regards to at various decision points. So whether that's around making decisions about, what are we going to do, strategic decisions, but particularly when we look at then putting ourselves forward for jobs, for instance. I think that's when, when it's about, me as a person, that's when I think the differences sort of come to the fore, if you like.
So what are some of those differences and what are the impacts that they have on applications?
Well, I think the basis of it is around gender roles, if you like, and whether, there are various stereotypes, if you like, around gender roles. The stereotype for a woman is to be more kind of demure and agreeable. The stereotype for men is to be more perhaps outspoken, assertive, competitive, if you like, and the research supports that as well. And so there are obvious play out in terms of stereotypes where people show that they believe in that stereotype, and then there can be more implicit behaviour where the person doesn't really even kind of fully realise that they are buying into that stereotype.
So that's sort of an unconscious bias towards that?
That's right, yeah, that's right. And so a behaviour that might seem a bit innocuous is in fact that stereotype sort of playing out. Now, there's varying degrees by which that stereotype might play out. You might find one context where it's actually playing out a lot, and in a different context it's not really playing out much at all. So it's not like all men will do it. Some men won't do it at all. Some men will do it. Some women will respond differently. But the research suggests that if you look at any cohort of people, there is a significant difference where more on balance it's playing out and in favour of men over women because of this gender stereotype. So what happens is you go into interview and then women feel there's a natural inclination to feel that they need to play the female role, which is more agreeable. The men feel like they can play the more aggressive, assertive, competitive role, and the danger is that the stereotype around leadership is that it's a aggressive, assertive, competitive type role. So you've got male and female stereotype, and the stereotype around leadership falls on the male side.
Yeah.
And so as a result, there are various perceptions that can come out that then are in favour of men. And then there's a variety of ways it can then play out in the actual interview itself, if you like.
Paul, we've heard today from a number of TA leaders that female applicants will normally read a job advertisement and only apply once they feel like they may meet nearly all the criteria.
Yep.
Whereas male applicants are quite different. They're much happier to apply only meeting a few of the criteria. Is it the same in the interview room?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think that there's to some degree a bit of a care factor. I think that males are probably on balance more likely to, not care as much potentially about, because they're not conflicted in their role, they feel they can be forward and they can, advance themselves and promote themselves without kind of being conflicted, right? I think women tend to be more conflicted on balance. And therefore, when it comes to the interview questions, it's almost like they're evaluating each question and going, okay, don't overstate yourself here. Make sure that you're being, quite honest and following the rules. Whereas I think guys are, generally speaking, a little less concerned about that. I mean, there is research around deceptive behaviour in interviews, which does demonstrate that males on balance are more likely to be deceptive. So, it might be the little white lie kind of thing. That will probably play out in interview as well.
So what can organisations and interviewers do, given this information? Well,
so I think the other thing that plays out in interviews as well is that if you've got a particular bias, so if the men have got a particular bias, you can actually be transmitted to the female candidate. And because the female candidate is more likely to be thinking, okay, what role am I supposed to be playing here? Whereas the male interviewee is probably going, I don't really care so much. Then they're going to pick up on the cues. Okay, so if you're a male interviewer and you've kind of decided or unconsciously transmitting a view that I'm not sure this woman is fitting the stereotype, they can send a signal. The woman can pick up on that signal and go, oh, so I'm not doing so well here, and then they become even more agreeable and even less confident in putting their points of view forward. So, I mean, it comes back to, there's a number of different things we can talk about in terms of what organisations and recruiters do. But if you're talking about actually in the interview itself, you need to increase your level of awareness around what you're doing and how you might be inadvertently sending a signal to a candidate that I actually don't think this is going as well as what you might be thinking, or I've kind of made up my mind. The idea around suspending judgment, I talk about, because I do some clinical work as well, and I talk to clients about the idea of suspending judgment. The idea, we all make judgments and we make decisions, but you can make a decision about a particular interview question, but try not to make a decision about halfway through the interview about whether this candidate is right or not. Suspend that judgment.
Oh, it happens all the time too, doesn't it?
And that's right.
And it is a conscious thing that you need to do and remind yourself of. And I catch myself all the time, reminding myself that a good first impression is good, but now we've got to have the whole interview. So
correct, that's right. I mean, I used to do it as a recruiter. Sometimes from an efficiency point of view, I'd be like, okay, I don't think this candidate is right, and so I wrapped up the interview earlier, and I'm sure I probably did that unfairly on some occasions. So it's we've all got to the idea around it's what is your commitment to being the best you can be in any profession, is to consider, okay, rather than get defensive, go, okay, yeah, sure, I might have some biases, so how do I become aware of it and just check myself on those things.
So what are some of the other things that organisations can do more broadly?
Well, I think that it's kind of like three stages. There's sort of pre-interview, during interview, and then post. All three. There's things to do at all three. So the prior to there's probably arguably there's most of the work pre, and this is about defining the job properly. So we all know that you tend to get to. I remember one of my jobs. They showed me the position description. It was nothing like the job itself, but it was just pulled out of the shelf, and then put on the job board, and because that was job done. But let me explain what the job is. You know what I mean? So the idea that you've got to put some more thought into it. Make sure, okay, is the position description up to date? But it's actually sometimes more than that, because sometimes it's like you look at a particular job and go, okay, well we need these kinds of competencies. But the next level of analysis is going, but what do we know actually creates success in the role? So as an example, in terms of consulting roles, when I was working in a consulting firm, I used to recruit for consultants, and I used to reflect on, okay, we can put down a bunch of competencies, but what do I reckon has been the competencies that have led us to be effective in the role? And it would be, say, being influential. People might say, well, that's a bit of left field. And you kind of go, well, if you can't influence your clients as your value proposition, then you're not going to get too far as a consultant. So that might be a competency that can kind of tend to be overlooked. It wouldn't necessarily be something you'd think firsthand, right? So sometimes the trouble with a capability framework is you go to the capability framework and you go, oh, okay, which of these will I choose, right? And just put them in the job description, as opposed to going, let's do a real analysis of this particular job and the success factors, right? So, and this is also a question of how much time people have, right? So some people will go, oh, I haven't got time for that. And I can understand
some of our
that,
other coaching videos that we've done in this series with Ross, we talk about the job description needs to be updated. And then you need to drill it down to the top 5 or 6 key competencies.
Yes.
And from those 5 or 6 competencies, that's what we're going to base our interview questions on.
That's right.
So the other parts of the job are important, but there's 5 things that are the most important.
Yes.
And we've got a limited time in the interview, so we need to concentrate our questions on those top competencies. Correct,
absolutely. So as I say, it's a logical flow through. Recruitment is a very disciplined. If you want to do recruitment well, it's actually, I always found there was almost like, roughly speaking, without generalising, 2 types of recruiters. One was the people person recruiter, and the other one was the process recruiter. I was kind of in the process recruiter. And I loved it from a process point of view. It's been really disciplined to follow through from that starting point of defining the job and then making sure what follows from there. So what follows from there is that we make sure that, for instance, the questions we've got actually address those competencies. Then it flows through that the interviewers are clear on that. So when they come in and step into the room, that they are following that process. And then when we come to evaluation as well, because sometimes you might do all the work defining the job, sharing it with the candidate's also another question, but asking the questions, and then you get to the evaluation, and sometimes it all goes out the window, depending on whether it's a panel or whether it's just one person, for instance. And it might go out the window, and suddenly you get a situation where there's 4 or 5 people in the room, and they're actually not looking at the criteria anymore, and they're going, what do you reckon?
Yeah, and that's where all the hard work and the criteria and maybe the scorecard that's being used can get thrown out the window by one rogue.
That's right, exactly. Well, but it's also kind of becomes a bit of a group think. Like if you've got a group there, it becomes could potentially group think, particularly if you've got I've seen evaluation panels where it's the CEO and then other managers, and the other managers are going, well, I'm not going to trump the CEO, am I? So, and the CEO says this, and they go, yeah, and you get a groupthink kind of scenario, right? So, and things become skewed. We had a criteria, but suddenly we've moved across to a different criteria now, and we go forward, and as you say, we undo the work that we've done. We don't necessarily have a scorecard. Now, I don't advocate for. I think there's some organisations that have gone to the other extreme, and if you cough for one candidate, you have to cough for the next candidate. You know what I mean? It's not about that, but it's about making sure that, from a competency point of view, that you're giving the candidates the opportunity to address those competencies in a fair manner, and effectively your behaviours are consistent generally, without going to that kind of extreme, if you like.
Do female candidates feel more comfortable in an interview being conducted by another female or by a male, or is there no clear data either way?
It's not necessarily a fact. I've actually seen some research that suggests that it depends on competence.
Okay.
And that female interviewers will sort of bias someone who's kind of not so threatening as far as competence is concerned, and actually perhaps help them, lift them up. But if there's a person at a equal or higher level of competence, they may actually disadvantage a woman just as much as what a male might.
Mm-hmm.
Because women can hold the same stereotypes, same gender stereotypes. So a woman can go into, as the interviewee, and hold the stereotype, for instance, that I need to be demure and agreeable, for instance. And so therefore a female interviewer can therefore hold the same and then judge the woman against the same criteria.
If we have two people doing the interviewing, maybe a male and a female, are we less likely to come across some of these issues, or are we twice as more likely to come across them?
Yeah, well, it depends on it depends on the two individuals and what kind of attitudes and stereotypes they have.
Mm-hmm.
So if they've both got the stereotypes, then yes, it could be double the trouble, because both of them might transmit some signals to the candidate. Both might come to the evaluation process and then go, oh, yep, he's really gunning for this. Great. Oh, she's a bit assertive, isn't she? So same behaviour but viewed differently. So, look, I think that it does go back to an equality issue as well. Regardless of who you've got interviewing, raise the level of awareness around how these things impact. Be aware of what the research says. Get your mindset into a purely objective mindset, regardless of put gender aside.
Yeah.
It's we've got a person in front of us.
I guess to that point, how do we make sure we aren't overcompensating the other way? And so we're aware. I think I read an article that said every single person has got a gender bias. Mm-hmm. That's just part of their nature. So if we're trying to address that and we're trying to be neutral, is there a danger that we do go too far the other way? And how do we keep that in check?
Well, I mean, how we keep it in check is just to realise that, we might overcompensate. Because there'll be a logic in some people's heads that, okay, overall there's more bias disadvantages women, so therefore I will try and balance it out. Mm-hmm. But that's not necessarily, it's really just going to perpetuate the same, it's going to perpetuate bias. We're trying to eliminate bias, if you like. So absolutely, there's the potential for that to occur. I mean, human nature, once again, coming back to from a clinical field, is very common for people who've been in situations in which they've experienced some extreme behaviour to say, I'm going to be nothing like that. But what they do is they overcorrect and go to the other end. Mm-hmm. So the idea of overcorrecting is a lot of people rationalise it and say, fair's fair. We need to overcorrect.
Yeah.
We just got to. It just all comes back to trying to be objective.
Yeah. One thing that I've learned, Paul, and only recently, is that men tend to speak, when they're the male interviewer, they tend to speak far more when interviewing females as opposed to interviewing other men. So I think there's a real reminder there about the importance of being a good listener.
Yes.
Being a good active listener.
Yep.
Particularly if a female candidate is less likely to promote.
Correct.
But there might be some clues there in some of their answers. So
yes.
I think regardless of who we're interviewing, being an active listener and making sure the candidate is speaking 80% of the time is vital.
Absolutely. There shouldn't be any reason why, as an interviewer, you're speaking any more than, say maximum 30% of the time. I mean, that 30% still seems like a lot. As you say, I think 80% for the candidate. There shouldn't be any reason for that. I mean, obviously, in the beginning, There's going to be, depending on what you want to transmit to the candidate, about the nature of the role and so on, how we're going to do the interview and so on. There's obviously going to be more of the interviewer talking. But once that's, it's really about, asking its question and then asking another follow-up question and so on. And yes, from probing, but absolutely the 80% rule should apply as much as possible. Yeah.
We have a lot of job types which might be dominated by one gender or the other.
Yep.
But particularly for roles where it's very male dominated, if we're interviewing a female candidate,
Yep.
how should we address that to make sure that they're comfortable coming into an environment that's, say, 95% male dominated?
Yeah, well, I think it's one thing to think about is the nature of the language that we're using in terms of, say, an assumption around that certain types of outcomes require certain types of behaviours, right? So, for instance, this idea that leadership requires someone to be, say, assertive and competitive, and we put those two competencies at the top of the list. But we do know that that people in general, I was going to say women, but men and women apply a whole range of different behaviours to be effective in a leader. There's a whole range of different behaviours. So I think it's making sure that if there's a kind of a male-dominated role, that we don't fall into the habit of then going, oh, okay, so because there's been more males and there are more males, we need more male qualities, which makes an assumption about the criteria, and then that feeds through. So it's really thinking about, it's thinking about what actually do we know about what creates good leadership, and or what creates a good engineer, or whatever this so-called male role is, rather than assuming that it must be male traits because we've got mostly men doing it. Yeah.
Paul, anything else that you'd like to add in closing?
Look, I think that I think we've talked about the objectivity. I think that it's really comes down to being conscious. Trying to raise the level from an organisational point of view, raise the level of awareness, and just keep pumping out the message around objectivity. And the usefulness, it's all about, if you're going to sell something to somebody, it's what's in it for you, right? So if you're going to get the best candidate, yes, you might have to spend a little bit more time defining the role, but that time that you spend to it will pay you back enormously when you find the candidate that does actually match what you really need and what you're really looking for. So, because everyone sort of goes into I'm really busy and, I've got so many interviews to do, and I can understand that. There can be compromises in the process as a result. And then you see the fact that candidate doesn't work out, they're not what we were hoping for, and then we have to potentially redo the process again. Yeah.
Paul, thanks very much for joining us today.
No worries, pleasure.